In the early hours when 15 Russian refineries burned simultaneously from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea, the Kremlin confronted a truth that no spokesperson was prepared to admit publicly. Ukraine had transformed Russia's own energy infrastructure, the backbone that finances every tank, every missile, and every soldier's paycheck at the front, into a battlefield, and it was winning that battlefield with an industrial brutality that Moscow could not contain. The numbers revealed the scale of the disaster before any satellite imagery reached Western analysts. 15 refining facilities struck in under 72 hours, the equivalent of approximately 12% of the entire Russian Federation's oil processing capacity, neutralized in a single operational cycle. To understand what that means in practice, Russia processes around 5,500,000 barrels of oil per day across its domestic refineries, and the Ukrainian campaign took offline enough capacity to fuel a country the size of Poland for entire weeks. And the central paradox of this offensive was devastating for Russian planning. Every destroyed refinery not only reduced Moscow's ability to convert crude oil into usable military fuel, diesel for armored vehicles, kerosene for aviation, gasoline for logistics columns, but simultaneously forced Russia to export crude oil at discounted prices instead of refined products with high profit margins. The Kremlin was losing the war and the money to finance it at the same time, and both losses fed each other. But the true impact of this operation went far beyond battlefield numbers. The Ukrainian campaign against Russian energy infrastructure was not born as improvisation. It was the result of more than 2 years of accelerated industrial development of long-range drones, unmanned aerial vehicles capable of traveling more than 1,200 kilometers from Ukrainian territory to refineries deep inside European Russia. The average cost of each drone used in these strikes ranged around $30,000 to $50,000 per unit, a microscopic fraction compared to the damage inflicted. A single mid-sized refinery costs between $500 million and $2 billion to build and takes 3 to 5 years to construct from the ground up. The equation was asymmetric in a way that no Soviet air defense manual had ever anticipated. The weapon had turned. Consider carefully what this number represents in practice. According to estimates compiled by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and corroborated by analyses from the British Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian campaign against Russian refineries accumulated direct damages exceeding $10 billion in structural harm since the beginning of systematic operations. And the indirect losses, measured in lost export revenue, cancelled contracts, and skyrocketing insurance premiums for tankers in the Black Sea, multiplied that figure by a factor of 3 to 5. For a Russian defense budget estimated at around $109 billion annually, already stretched to its limit by the ground war, every billion lost in energy infrastructure was $1 billion less available for ammunition, armored vehicle replacement, and bonus payments to volunteers. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data deserved. China, the single largest individual buyer of Russian oil since Western sanctions redirected Moscow's energy flows toward the east, was watching the degradation of Russian refining capacity with a calculated strategic satisfaction that few analysts were decoding in real time. With Russian refineries operating at reduced capacity, Russia was forced to export increasing volumes of unprocessed crude oil, exactly the product Beijing preferred to buy, because it fed China's own refineries running below capacity and generated domestic jobs in the Chinese petrochemical industry. Each Ukrainian drone that destroyed a Russian refinery, paradoxically, strengthened Beijing's negotiating position and deepened Moscow's dependence on the buyer who dictated the terms. According to bilateral trade data, the average discount China was obtaining on Russian Urals crude, relative to international Brent, had widened to between $15 and $20 per barrel, a margin that represented, in annual volume, a wealth transfer of tens of billions of dollars from Moscow to Beijing. The board had been flipped. Step back for a moment and look at the complete picture. Russian military logistics at the front depended on a supply chain that began at the refineries and ended at forward depots a few kilometers from the line of contact. Diesel for the T-72 and T-90 armored vehicles still operating in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. aviation kerosene for the Su-34 bombers dropping glide bombs on Ukrainian positions, fuel for the Kamaz trucks transporting artillery ammunition from rail depots to frontline batteries. Every link in this chain had been identified, mapped, and struck by Ukrainian military intelligence with a precision that revealed not only technical capability, but deep informational penetration of the Russian logistics network. Fuel depots in Belgorod, in Bryansk, in Voronezh, cities hundreds of kilometers from the front but functioning as vital arteries of the war effort, were struck repeatedly, some of them more than 3 times in a single month. But there was a layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. General Valery Zaluzhny, before leaving command of the Ukrainian armed forces, had articulated in internal documents that later partially leaked to the Western press a doctrine he informally called energy attrition warfare, the idea that Ukraine, incapable of defeating Russia in armored mass or in depth of human reserves, could win in the dimension Russia considered invulnerable, the conversion of oil into combat power. Zaluzhny, an infantry officer with a classical Soviet formation and 2 traits that defined him before his subordinates, the methodical coldness with which he analyzed friendly casualties and the absolute refusal to participate in press briefings, was not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He was the intellectual coordinate that revealed how Kiev had transformed an apparent weakness into offensive doctrine. And here is what that layer revealed. The campaign against refineries was not economic terrorism, nor emotional retaliation for Russian bombardments of Ukrainian electrical infrastructure. Although the Kremlin's narrative insisted on that version, it was attrition warfare applied to the industrial dimension with surgical precision. Every refinery selected as a target corresponded to a specific logistical node within the Russian war effort. The Novoshakhtinsk refinery in the Rostov region directly supplied forces operating in southern Ukraine. The Kirishi plant in the Leningrad region processed aviation fuel for the bomber fleet of the Western Military District. The Nizhny Novgorod refinery, one of the largest in the country, with a capacity of 340,000 barrels per day, fed the central depots from which rail logistics columns departed toward the front. Destroying these specific installations was not destroying the Russian economy as a whole. It was severing the arteries carrying operational blood to the combat forces. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany in World War II, which is the comparison that appears most frequently in superficial commentary. It is the American mining campaign of Japanese ports in 1945, Operation Starvation. In that operation, the United States did not attempt to destroy Japanese industry entirely. They identified the logistical choke points, the ports and straits through which fuel and raw materials passed, and closed them with mines. Japan had intact factories that could not produce because the fuel was not arriving. Russia in 2026 had intact oil wells that could not supply the front because the refineries standing between the well and the tank had been converted into smoldering ruins. The parallel was structurally exact. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. And then we arrive at the question that no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. Russian air defense, the S-300, S-400, and Pantsir systems that Moscow presented as the impenetrable shield of Russian airspace had systematically failed to protect the country's energy infrastructure, not through pure technical incompetence, but because of a mathematical limitation that the very design of the war had created. Russia possessed, according to estimates from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, between 80 and 100 operational S-400 batteries across its entire territory, a number that seems impressive until one considers that Russian territory spans more than 17 million square kilometers, and that each S-400 battery effectively covers a radius of approximately 250 kilometers for low-altitude targets such as drones. It was physically impossible to protect every refinery, every depot, every rail junction simultaneously. And Ukraine, with its growing fleet of long-range drones, estimated by Western sources at a production capacity of more than 4,000 units per month, could strike along multiple simultaneous vectors, saturating defenses at one point while the actual target lay 500 kilometers away. The plan had failed, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy had anticipated every move before the first shot was fired. Look at what this reveals about the conflict's dynamics. The Russian fiscal deficit, the gap between what the state collects and what it spends to sustain the war, had widened to levels that economists at the Russian central bank were internally describing as unsustainable in the medium term, according to documents analyzed by the Financial Times. Russia's benchmark interest rate remained above 20%, a level that strangled domestic credit and made every investment in infrastructure reconstruction prohibitively expensive. To rebuild the 15 struck refineries, Russia would need investments on the order of $8 to $12 billion and timelines of 3 to 5 years, assuming the same facilities were not struck again during reconstruction. It was a cycle of destruction and cost that consumed resources that would otherwise go to the front. Russia cannot sustain this bleeding indefinitely, and the end of that period will determine the future not of one country, but of all of Europe. And the greatest paradox of the entire crisis lay precisely here. Every destroyed refinery forced Russia to import petroleum products it had previously produced domestically, diesel from India, gasoline from Turkey, using the same scarce dollars it needed to buy smuggled electronic components for its missiles and drones. The country possessing the world's largest natural gas reserves and the second largest oil production on the planet was at that moment importing fuel like a nation without resources of its own. Each $50,000 Ukrainian drone that struck a refinery generated a cost of replacement, reconstruction, and importation that exceeded $100 million in the months following the impact. The asymmetry was not merely military, it was civilizational. What the Ukrainian campaign against Russian logistics and refineries established was not simply a new chapter in the war. It was a new paradigm of asymmetric conflict, where a smaller, poorer country with fewer resources can systematically degrade the combat capacity of a nuclear superpower by striking not its soldiers, but the industrial system that keeps them in the field. The question now confronting every strategist in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels is direct. If Russia cannot restore its refining capacity before the winter of 2026 arrives, when domestic demand for heating fuel spikes and the competition between supplying the front and heating the population becomes inescapable, how far will Putin be willing to escalate to compensate on the battlefield for what he is losing at the refineries? The next chapter of this war will be written in fire, and the fires are already burning. If this analysis opened a dimension of the conflict that the headlines were not showing, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the developments of this campaign will redraw the energy map of the war in the coming months, and this channel will follow every move.